Okay, we are live.
Good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we are welcoming representatives from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies to help us learn more about natural communities. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. All right.
Takes a second.
Little delay.
There you go.
Yeah, all right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Ron Rebozo, Science Director at Vermont Center for Eco Studies. With me, I also have our staff biologist, Amber Jones. And thanks again for the invitation to speak a little bit about natural communities, what they are, how we kind of classify them, and what role they play in our kind of thinking around conservation and species protections. I'll start really quickly. Let's see here. There we go. It'll take a second, but just about our organization in half a minute or so. We're a research nonprofit. We conduct applied ecological research, meaning we aim to have our work inform land managers, practitioners, policymakers to have the information they need to best protect our habitats in the state and rare species. We do this through research, monitoring, and outreach. So as you can imagine, we do think about natural communities quite a bit and in different contexts, right? It can be what you'll see on the left-hand side, mapping natural communities. This is taken from one of our publications where we mapped high elevation spruce fir forests to identify critical breeding habitat for one of our high elevation birds, the bignell thrush. So mapping these areas so we know where we might expect to find species, or on the right-hand side, monitoring the management of rare or uncommon natural communities. So this was in Green Mountain National Forest, monitoring the forest response to using prescribed burning as a management tool in the forest.
Do you know where that prescribed burn was?
This was at the Dome in Pownell, so southwestern corner of the National Forest. Yeah, it was a dry oak forest, a natural community type that, you know, if you look at the plant species, suggests some history of fire disturbance naturally. So they were using that as a tool to see if they can maintain that oak-dominated canopy. So before I dive into that natural community piece, I'm going to start at the species level. I know, at least for me, it's easier to wrap my mind around species. You know, natural communities start to get a little more complicated, but there's a lot of overlap in how we track rare species with how we think about natural communities. So, you know, if we say that this is a rare species, I think intuitively we recognize that that means there are a few individuals, and that's true. That makes good sense. But there is value in knowing just how rare something is and having a system for kind of ranking rarity. And we do that at two different levels. We do this at a global level. So that's the G numbers we have here on the left side. And that doesn't necessarily mean global. What it really means is throughout that species' entire range. Some species are really widely distributed, right? From Florida to Canada, you can find them. Others we know are a lot more constricted, might be limited to a state or two. So that global rank gives us an idea of how secure or imperiled they are throughout their entire range. The other level is a little closer to home. It's the state level. And of course, rare species don't recognize state boundaries. But again, it's easier for us to think at state levels, right? We're familiar with the boundaries and how big Vermont is. But it also makes good sense in that a lot of rare species protections do happen at the state level. States monitor and track their species differently. In both cases, that global and that state level, they're ranked 1 through 5. 5 is going to be those species that are most secure, you know, things that you can find pretty readily, white pine, red maple. S1, the ones are going to be those that are most critically imperiled, of the rarest species we have. In plants, we track them by occurrences. So an F1 plant species is going to have only 5 or fewer occurrences in the state. So pretty rare, very rare. You know, knowing how rare something is kind of a piece to the story of how do we then, you know, protect species or try to recover species. You know, it's a kind of that foundational piece for, say, a recovery plan, right? You have to first know how rare something is, what's causing that species to be rare, what threats exist, and then what actions we might take to help protect that species or kind of try to have rebound populations. I have a picture of a loon there because I think that's a really good example of a success story in the state as a result of recovery plans, right? We find that when we, you know, put the time in to kind of learn what we need to learn about a species to develop a recovery plan and kind of carry out some of the suggested actions, we can have positive effects. Loons, less than 40 years ago, were down to 7 nesting pairs in the state. Now we're up to over 100, right? So, you know, a good success story. Bald eagles are another good example of that. But I think, there's kind of some costs associated with that, right? We only have 11 recovery plans in the state. I think there are 2 in draft form, so that number will change, but that's a very small fraction of all the rare species, right? It takes a lot of time and energy to come up with a recovery plan and carry it out. So it's not really feasible to do that for all of our rare species, at least in a quick time frame. Yes.
Just a number, I just want to get the number.
11,
Current 11
11
nesting.
recovery plans.
Okay, thank you.
Were you asking about recovery plans or?
Oh, no, loons.
Oh, I'm sorry. So we're over 100. I believe it's
Okay.
106.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So actually though, since I was curious if you want questions at the end or during.
I can take them as they come. I think that's good.
We got in a little bit deep into how rare species are tracked yesterday.
Oh, great. Okay.
Learning a lot about that. And I guess I would love your thoughts on in particular with wildlife, but it was interesting that you put an actual number to plants, that 5 or fewer
Yeah.
was a number. It's harder with wildlife, I imagine.
Yeah.
And to some extent, the type of plant should matter too, I would imagine. But just your thoughts or comments on how in the modern era we define common and knowing that things are kind of globally declining. What does abundant mean, or what does ready to be delisted mean in your thinking? How do you think about it?
Yeah. So for delisting, I think it is kind of species and taxa specific because that's kind of the way we track them. I think it would have to, a lot of it would be based on what we know about why these species were rare to begin with and how populations may have changed over time.
Or if we know that they were rare to begin with? What if they weren't rare to begin with?
Right. So yeah, so if something was, if we have good reason to think that this was a common and abundant species in the past and has in the recent history become more rare, then we might have a target number that we would want to see those populations return to. I think that was the case for bald eagles and loons, right? We know these were species that occupied more lakes in the past. They had reductions in their numbers as management of lake shorelines changed, and there were some actions that brought them back. In other cases, there are some species that are rare, and I think I'll touch on this in a coming slide, based on their life histories and their affinities for certain habitat types. And those species might be those that, maybe aren't candidates for an increase in population because they are historically rare species. So I think some of it has to be what we know about their historical abundance or distribution and how that may have changed to our current levels, and then that might inform what a target is to then say this species is now stable. It's at a level that we think is reflective of the habitat that's available for it in the state, and thus it could be delisted.
Thank you.
So I think relevant to that, types of rarity is important, right? I talked about relative rarity, how rare something is. It's important to know, what type of rarity we're talking about here. So, if I start at the bottom here, population size is, I think, what we tend to think of, right? Few number of individuals. I use lynx as an example here, right? We know it's a species that becomes more abundant as you move up into the boreal forests of Canada, but we know that they're rare here, right? Rare enough that, sightings last year made the news, right? It was something newsworthy. Again, that's kind of where global versus state level comes into play, right? We know they might be more abundant somewhere else, but certainly locally they're rare. Geographic range, the middle example here, is another, right? These are species that could potentially be locally abundant, right? When you find them, there might be many individuals, but they're just physically restricted to a small geographic range. I use this example here. This is a Green Mountain quillwort. This is a species that was first discovered, I think, 5 years ago and was identified as a new species to science, 2 years ago. It was given a name. And I believe it's just limited to 2 occurrences in the Green Mountains, right? So even if at those occurrences you're finding many individuals, it's still rare because it's just limited to 2 pockets, right? Similarly, habitat range, the top one, some species, again, can be locally abundant, but they have a specific affinity to a certain habitat type. That's a bog elfin. It's found in black spruce bogs. And while we have them around the state, it just suggests that that species is limited to a very specific habitat type. That is limited here, becomes, again, more common as you move northward. So again, this kind of helps inform that story of, if it's appropriate to try to put efforts into increase numbers of species based on why that species might be rare, what we know about it. Just to kind of illustrate this kind of state and global ranks on maps, I'm just going to give two really quick examples of S1 plants that I've mentioned are 5 or fewer occurrences. So this is Boots rattlesnake root, a very rare species in Vermont. It's only found in 3 counties. What this map is showing are the states in green, just mean that this species exists in that state. This is really a county level map. So the yellow are the counties in which it's found. And the yellow suggests that it's a rare species there. So we know it's very rare in Vermont because it's an S1. We find that it's only in about 5 other counties in the Northeast, and it's rare everywhere it's found. So it has that G2 ranking, right? We know globally throughout its range, it's a pretty rare species. On the other side of the coin, here's another S1, very rare in Vermont, but a different story throughout its range, right? We can find it exists down in the Southeast, up in the Midwest, and it's green at the county level means it's common. So it's a very secure species throughout its range, G5, but in Vermont, it's very rare. So we might treat these species a little differently based on what our objectives are for protecting these plants. That brings me kind of to the natural community level. And this is kind of taking a step back from that species level because it encompasses all the species in that community. And natural communities really are assemblages of plants, animals, fungi, everything that tend to repeat across a landscape when similar conditions are found, right? Similar bedrock, similar soil conditions, similar microclimates or elevation. When those conditions repeat around the landscape, you tend to find these unique assemblages popping up because those are the species that are the best competitors for those types of conditions. So they tend to dominate. We have 97 different natural communities in Vermont. So that kind of speaks to the variety of habitat types and biophysical regions we have, and just kind of the specificity in which we can map and describe these natural communities. And it is just kind of worth highlighting that they are in fact communities. It includes plants, animals, fungi, just about everything. We tend to describe them and name them based on dominant tree species, which again, I think makes good sense. You walk into a forest, the trees are what you see. They're obvious year round. You don't have to like turn logs over to find salamanders. You don't have to listen for birds. The trees are there and they tell you a story. In some other cases, they're described by kind of abiotic factors that really set the stage for all the plants and animals we see. I'm thinking of things like talus slopes, cobbled shorelines, sand dunes, right? Described by kind of the physical conditions of the site. And, it kind of plays into this story of, conservation and species protections in general, because by protecting or thinking about at least natural communities, there is kind of an umbrella effect, right? Whereas at the species specific level, you have to put a lot of time and energy into one species. If you protect a natural community, you're catching all types of species in that assemblage, right? The generalist species, the common species that are found there, but also the specialists that might be restricted to that habitat, or the rare species that are found there as well, right? So it really is kind of a little more encompassing in that sense. The state kind of describes it as fine filter approach would be, species level, and then more of a coarse filter approach to conservation would be natural community and habitat and bigger picture. At some level, it's an important tool in the toolbox, right? I mentioned, again, just the 11 recovery plans in the state. And even though recovery plans show a lot of good success, it's just a small fraction of all the rare species that exist, right? So while, recovery plans, again, have their value, we're kind of limited in how many we can have. And this is a different approach to kind of capture more species, especially as we continue to see changes in biodiversity over the coming decades. It becomes important to keep common things common. I think to your point about thinking about rarity and how things are going to change. So not surprisingly, natural communities are featured in Vermont conservation design. It was nice to see that you have a poster here hanging up, kind of illustrating it in full. But it's just one layer on top of some of the other important factors that Vermont conservation design tracks, forest interior blocks, connectivity corridors, but they are highlighted in the map. This is some of the natural communities pulled out because of their value in this kind of conservation story as being an important tool. Just like species, we track them with these state ranks. And as you'd expect, some natural communities are very common, others are very rare. And it's still that 1 through 5 numbering system, 1 being critically imperiled or rare, 5 being very secure or common. Couple examples: northern hardwood forest, what we're all probably familiar with. probably the most common natural community type that we have, dominated by maple, beech, birch. But a couple other examples of common ones: alder swamps, hemlock, northern hardwood forests, and then to some very rare ones that are even in some cases surprising that we have in Vermont, right? Sand dunes, alpine meadows, Krummholz when you get up to the high elevations. Now, a lot of these natural communities can be found in very different biophysical regions in Vermont. We have 9 distinct regions based on things like the bedrock, which again sets the stage for our soils, local climates, wintertime low temperatures. I'll apologize right off the bat. I'm recognizing this is an old map of our biophysical regions. We recognize 9 now. So that Champlain Valley in the Northwest is now separated into Champlain Valley and Champlain Hills. Kind of the eastern end of that biophysical region is higher in elevation, and they actually, the forests there are recognized as a different biophysical region. But, you know, this plays into some of these natural community types that can be found statewide, right? So this is kind of highlighting these S ranks at the community level and how they're found in the state. Northern hardwood forest, again, I think is a great example because it's very common. S5, that green doesn't suggest all of Vermont is a northern hardwood forest. It just suggests you can find it anywhere in the state. Kind of an intermediate example, an S3, this white cedar swamp, is typically found in the northern half of the state. And then a more extreme example, an S1, these alpine meadows are limited to just our highest peaks, right? Mansfield, Campbell's Hump, right at the top, very small, so they're just dots on the map. Because we have some of these natural communities that can be found statewide, that again, northern hardwood forest that I'm going to kind of keep poking at, you can expect that there are going to be some variations because of how different these biophysical regions are. So at that point, we recognize variants of certain natural community types. And northern hardwood forest has these 4 other variants based on usually soil conditions, right? A northern hardwood forest that's growing on top of a slightly drier, slightly sandier soil is likely to have white pine as now a co-dominant species. Whereas, you know, in other situations, you might find some white pines, but they're not really going to be a co-dominant in the canopy. In really rich soils where we have northern hardwood forest, you might see sugar maple, you might see white ash as co-dominant trees. Yellow birch might be co-dominant where you have kind of more structure and you have some of these nurse logs that can support the germination of yellow birch. So some of these slight variations that, again, tend to be repeated across the state in these different biophysical regions result in different variants. Now, natural communities are subject to change and succession and disturbance, just like anything else, right? Some natural communities are really stable in their standings. I'm thinking of things like fens that are built over long periods of time, right? Lots of peat moss that are built up. They kind of maintain their own microclimate and hydrology, so they kind of remain usually pretty stable if the hydrology stays intact. Other forest types might change in their variant because of their maturity over time, right? A forest that is relatively young, that might be dominated by younger tree species like cherries or white pines, may mature, given enough time, into, you know, something that's hemlock dominated. So that's kind of where the variants come into play. And over a landscape large enough as a state, you end up having a mosaic of different natural communities and different successional stages that then support, you know, kind of all the kinds of biodiversity that we'd like to support. So what can natural communities tell us? You know, to me, I think this is kind of why I enjoy getting to know plants and studying plants, is that, you know, once you get to know a few species and you know a little bit about their life history, a little bit about their habitat affinities, you can get out into a forest and it starts to tell you a story about everything from soil conditions, right? Is it rich? Is it poor? Is it acidic? Microclimates, wintertime low temperatures, which is really a limiting factor in what can survive in a lot of our forests. Things like disturbance history. So you get a story about that habitat type that, you know, without getting a good sense of the plant species would be a lot harder to tease out. They can also tell us about what animal species you might expect, right? If we have a mature beech stand, we might think that it's going to support some good game species, right? If you have a buttonbush swamp, that's that flower there in the middle, that's going to support a lot of pollinators when that thing's flowering. It can also tell us what we would want to monitor or study when we're looking at these natural communities, because we have a sense of the trajectory of that forest. It can also really help inform restoration efforts, right? If we're trying to restore an area, trying to mimic the natural community in the surrounding areas or what it was, would not only increase the likelihood that these, you know, plantings or restoration efforts will be successful, but that they're going to support biodiversity beyond just what is put in the ground. And because these natural communities are built on species, they're subject to the same threats that we track for species, right? Climate change, habitat loss and fragmentation, invasive species. I'll add deer browse in there when there's instances of high deer densities and pollution. It's important that we have a good sense of where these natural communities are, and the state has done a really kind of impressive job of mapping these throughout Vermont. But it's also interesting to think about how these might change into the future, right? So just highlighting some of the work that we do on the modeling side of things. We have our Vermont Atlas of Life, which is our kind of big data repository for all things biodiversity in Vermont. We're up to about 11 million records or so. So it gives us really good confidence in what species we have in Vermont and where they're found in the state. To make that useful moving forward, it's good to be able to model how species distributions are going to change in the future, right? Species are going to move into Vermont that we don't have now. Species are going to move out. Our kind of diversity is going to change. And with that, natural community composition is likely to change too. So I just kind of highlight that as, kind of that kind of other level of conservation planning that we tend to think about.
Can you just talk a little about how you do that?
Yeah, so a lot of our models now have been based on bedrocks and soils, because that's kind of the foundation for the plant communities that are going to be grown there, and different climate change models, right? So if our average annual temperatures change by, different kind of scenarios, emission scenarios, what would that look like? What we're hoping to do now is add a couple other variables to this model to kind of make it more robust, right? Land use change. What would it look like if we were at build out, right? So we have less physical availability of habitat and some other factors that might tell the story of the likelihood of species to move in and out. One piece that we're starting to do or have done with some species that also helps tell the story is not just what is it going to look like at, 2070 or 2100 as a kind of a static map, but at what rate of change is our species going to move, right? So, we call that climate velocity, right? So in what direction and how fast our species going to move, because we know some species are more adaptive and others less so. Some are much more mobile than others, so things are going to move at different rates. Insects might be able to move in and out a lot more easily than, say, some plant species. So we're trying to add some complexity to those models, but what we're showing here now is a model of what we expect to be for each biophysical region, the 10% of land mass that's going to support the most biodiversity at the end of the century. And this is based on soil conditions and climate.
Are you working with or involved at all with Act 59 implementation?
We're not. We are working with the state to kind of use some of our species distribution models to complement Vermont conservation design. So Vermont conservation design, again, is kind of that bigger picture force filter approach. That species level, species distribution level is at the more fine filter approach. So what we're hoping to do is, as we continue to improve our models and our species distributions, run that with Vermont conservation design and see which species are really well covered by VCD as it is now, and then what species may or may not fall through the cracks, right? That just, species or taxa or guilds or life history traits that might not be well covered. So we are partnering with the state on that, and, hopefully will lead to just kind of a more robust planning.
I mean, I guess I'm finding myself like this slide is saying a lot. Current conservation lands today only protect 13% of species ranges, and in the future are projected to protect 11%. Right.
It kind of highlights the importance of private lands in the state.
It sure does.
Yeah.
And increasing our conservation lands.
So at the conservation land level, if we're thinking about highest priority natural communities, which are the S1 through S3s, really basically everything we would consider uncommon. Our data manager put together a nice slide, I think, that kind of highlights the distribution of these natural communities in the state. And you can see a lot of them are kind of small and they're, patchily distributed all through the state. S1 natural communities, the rarest ones in particular, are typically very small in a lot of cases. The yellow are these high priority natural communities. They're, again, kind of spread out. Many of them are very small and difficult to see on this map, but some areas really stand out, right? Like the spine of the Green Mountains, the higher elevation sites, obviously. Green are the overlap areas where these natural communities exist on state lands. And then blue is additional state managed land that is, does not contain an S1 through S3 natural community. We can see about 15% or so of S1 natural communities are found on state land, a little more for S2, 19, almost 20%. And then a significant amount, 48, almost 50% of S3s. In trying to just kind of break these natural communities out by biophysical region and give us a sense of acres, I kind of have this table here. So it gives us a sense that there's, significant acreage of natural communities found on state lands. To try to make this relevant in, to discussions that I think the committee was having around build passive management of natural communities on state lands, I, put this next to the old growth targets that VCD has outlined for each biophysical region. VCD has kind of suggested what a target would be for passively managed forests on each of these biophysical regions, and then the percentage of natural communities in those regions, and what percentage of that target they would make up. And it's quite a range, right? So Vermont Valley is about 3%, up to 50% in the Northern Islands, the Northeast Kingdom.
Representative Tagliavia.
Can you tell me what you mean by passive management?
Passive management, as I understand it, would just be no extractive management of the forest. I think it would depend very specifically on how it's defined, if that means managing for invasive species or, other ecological issues. But my understanding is that would mean no extractive use.
Meaning excluding working lands?
I believe so. So just to kind of wrap up, I just highlighted a couple interesting natural communities, the kinds of things you wouldn't expect to exist in Vermont necessarily, right? We have sand dunes, and not just that we have sand dunes, but the plant species in that community are the same species you would find on barrier islands in the mid-Atlantic, for example. And pitch pine, oak heath, which is pretty rare, that map would make it seem as if it could be found in most of Western Vermont, but they're really just small little pockets. That's, plant species that are more like the coastal Carolinas, right? And alpine meadows that support tundra species. So an interesting mix of things, usually pretty small in scale, but distributed throughout the state. So I'm happy to take more questions. I also like to maybe turn it over to Amber, who can work through BioFinders to give you an idea of how these natural communities are mapped by the state and how the state has kind of an interactive tool to explore some of these things.
Thank you for your presentation. Do members have questions, further questions? For now, not seeing any, but
At the end,
if you have one for Ryan, you can ask now.
I think you can answer this. I just read that the Trump administration is taking the word harm out of the EPA Endangered Species Act. It's gonna, and that will mean that habitat will be excluded now, considering harm. And it's mainly for the extraction of energy, oil, natural gases. Do you know if we have that in Vermont, any natural gas or, I don't think so.
I don't believe we have any natural gas extraction in Vermont. No.
Well, any energy at all that they could destroy a habitat to access any kind of.
Yeah, I suppose, it really depends on the language, and I'm not as familiar with that and how that applies to state regulations, but I can imagine the siting of wind turbines or solar panels, right? If it were, if we had the burden of proving or demonstrating harm, but I don't know the specifics of that well enough.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Amber. I'm the staff biologist at VCE. And we're just going to take you just a quick run through on BioFinder if you're not familiar with it. And this is the Agency of Natural Resources mapping of all things biotic in Vermont. So I'm not used to this computer. So you can see on the right-hand side of the screen that there's a bunch of layers that we can sort through. And so I'll just kind of take you through quickly what this looks like. For some of the maps that we had for natural communities, let's see, if we go under the species and community scale components, it gives you a bunch of options. So we could click on vernal pools, for example. And it's going to give us highest priority and priority vernal pools. And then we can zoom in. And maybe we can zoom in. And zoom into much easier with a mouse. I get to Montpelier. Okay, so if we zoom into Montpelier area and give it a minute to populate. There we go. So now you can see all these blue dots on the screen. Those are all vernal pools in the Montpelier area. The dark blue are your highest priority vernal pools, and then the lighter blue are priority. And those may be that they're unconfirmed pools, but they suspect there are pools there, or they're just not as rich in life as the highest priority ones are. Let me see, if we scroll up, we can change the different landscape cover. So I'm going to unclick this landscape scale. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to try to take these roads out of here so it's a little easier for everybody to see. Okay. So as you can see, all these layers here, you can add roads, you can take roads away, you can look at where there's Act 250 permits, where there's bridges and culverts. But what we want is to maybe look at our natural communities. This is probably. So I'm going to click the natural communities tab, and that's just going to show us our highest priority and priority natural communities. Now you can zoom in or out, you can look around your house, you can look around cities and other areas. And if I can get us over to, I wanted to point out Burlington, because I thought this was really interesting, is so Burlington and Colchester, Essex, this is a really built up area. And you wouldn't expect to find, you would think that these would be more rural places that you would find all these great natural communities, but really looking in here, all these brown spots are highest priority natural communities. And you can click on the spot and it'll give you a whole list of information about it. So this one is an S1 rank. So this is your rarest natural community, dry pine oak heath, Champlain forest. And this is right outside the Burlington area. And then down here is another, this one's an S4, so just a cattail marsh. And click on another, see this is another S1, dry pine oak, heath, Champlain forest. So if you're not familiar with BioFinder, this is a really great tool to be able to look. You can sort it by biophysical region. We can look at counties. You can look at the Vermont conservation design. We can look at interior forest blocks or connectivity blocks, really anything. And then up top where it says prioritization, there's also a drop down there. Select the layer. And then there you can look at the social vulnerability indexes of Vermont and also inventory, which is mostly like where your culverts and your roads and more of the see, smart growth designation boundaries and things like that for our purposes. We're under prioritization. So I don't know if anybody has any questions on this, if there's anything you want me to point out, or maybe you already are all very familiar with this and don't.
No, we're not. And
Right.
I really appreciate that you
Okay.
brought this
Yeah.
to our attention.
Okay.
Some of us are. I've used it for work, but others haven't.
Okay,
Representative Austin and Bartholomew.
Yeah, so we recently passed a bill in the legislature to not disclose the identity of endangered species. So if, like, I'm on the planning commission, I wonder if I looked at this map, would that give me, if it was an S1, locations of where those
the species are.
would not be disclosed or should not be disclosed?
So
Is that-
let me take off, I'll click on the rare and threatened and endangered species. So this shows you a general idea of where rare, threatened, or endangered species have been
And that's
reported.
their S1, would that be?
Well, we can click on each blob.
Okay.
See that one, yeah, so this one just tells us that it doesn't have a state protection status, and it doesn't have a federal protection status, but it is a highest priority in the state. It doesn't tell us what it is,
Mhm.
and it doesn't tell us exactly where it is. Oh, actually, sorry, we were on the other. So this must have been for the natural community, because if you click over here, rare and uncommon species, this does have a state protection status, sorry, and it does have a federal, and it is a highest priority, the big circle now, it's blue circle. So it's not going to tell you what the species is, it's not going to tell you exactly where to find it, but it is going to tell you on the map where it was. Does that answer the question?
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Representative Bartholomew.
I'm just playing around here.
Yeah.
When the map comes up, there are all these colors. How do you tell what the colors refer to?
But yeah.
Is there a key somewhere that,
So on the layer side, if you scroll all the way up, all the green and yellow there is under overall priorities, Vermont conservation design. And if you unclick that, the greens will go away, but it doesn't give you the little key like the other ones do. I imagine if we clicked on, let's see. It's back to, if you click on that green, the dark or the light green area, it should tell you what. I've never tried this on a tablet.
I just thought it might be a key somewhere.
Yeah, that one, I don't know why those colors don't show up. Click on. Are there any other questions in the meantime while I try to?
Any questions on this or for Ryan? Seeing any?
Okay, great. Yeah, there's no other questions. I guess I'm not sure where the green and light green colors.
We'll ask A&R next time they're in.
Yeah.
How come they're missing from the legend?
Yeah,
Kind of, everyone else shows up tells you what they are. Yeah.
yeah, if I click it here, it doesn't pull anything up. It just shows landscape sale, but it doesn't give a. Yeah, interesting question. Thank you for that, because I don't know the answer, so that'll give me something to.
It's very colorful,
Yeah.
whatever they mean.
Yeah, well, they do tell you what they mean, and then you can also turn them off and get more detail from everything underneath. All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, members, that's what we had on the agenda for today. We are going to, do members have anything they want to discuss before we adjourn for the weekend?
What was the bill that came out yesterday that got sent to us? 507? How do we go about pulling that off the wall?
We could have the sponsor introduce it, but it's, yeah, we have the sponsor introduce it.
I'll let them know.
But I haven't looked at it. I said we could have it. I don't know. We got a couple of them sent to us. I don't know which one that one is. Anything else?
Just on the bills that we went over this week, is there any focus that we should be thinking about or in terms of, are we very close?
I'm hoping we're close. I mean, I think on 86, we're still, Michael O'Grady wasn't available on this morning to come in with changes to 230 for us. House Judiciary is still working on 86. They're going to look at it hopefully Tuesday afternoon, but I don't think Michael was available. I'm trying to get them finished, wrapped up. And moving on, I think, as far as, we're sort of still, we're going to hear a little bit more about what Panthera has done, the social side of the research that they've done in their thinking about the Catamount next week. Like I think I mentioned what I'm going to do, which is going to compile the questions that have come around that idea. And then on the PRO, I think I'm really interested in learning more about what the actual costs from the folks who'd be running it think they need, like dollar amounts. We haven't gotten, they sort of have said, oh, we need money, but I'd like to know more about specifics.
So I think it was Clink. Is that what, we recommend that? Is that just informative? What should we take from that in terms of the?
Well, for me, I thought it was super interesting to learn about the details of that. We sort of had heard vaguely what that type of opportunity offered. I think from what I took away was making sure that any guidance we provide through legislation includes both convenience and diversity of opportunities, right? Like different ways to redeem your bottles.
But is that up to the PRO to make that decision to use that? Is that,
Yeah.
that would be an option.
Right, I think so.
And
Yeah,
just-
Representative Bartholomew.
If they're a company, it'd be up to them. And one of the questions I asked was whether there were any impediments to them coming here. And I think, if I remember right, he said, no, not really. So they could find partners and come and start, but I don't think there's anything we could do to make them.
No,
pick them. I didn't know if that's what you're asking.
Well, it seemed like they had partnered with PROs in the past and that they were maybe waiting for that. I mean, I don't.
There might be an incentive for them.
Yes, I got the sense that some structure would help them probably have confidence to come into the state.
Just, where are we headed with beavers? Just, are we heading somewhere or?
Do you have somewhere that you want to head with beavers?
No, I mean, I just didn't know if we were just becoming more educated about beavers.
So far, that's
So
what we're
far.
doing. I mean, I think that they're,
I love learning about it. I'm just wondering if this something that we're working towards or if it's just making us aware.
well, and just public service announcement reminder that Larry's on a panel next Thursday. Is it at the screenings at the Savoy?
Yeah.
I have that wrong. So next Wednesday at the Savoy at what time?
6 o'clock on the evening. I'll check. Double check.
Talking about beavers further.
It is at 6.
All right.
6 o'clock on Wednesday.
With that, I hope everyone has a good weekend, however you celebrate this weekend of spring.
Happy Easter if you celebrate Easter.